The Millers' dining room gleamed with the soft light of expensive candles as Jack watched his mother-in-law, Linda, subtly reposition the silverware he'd just straightened. 6 months of marriage, and still these Sunday dinners felt like job interviews he kept failing. He caught Emily's eye across the table, her smile tight at the corners, despite the champagne Linda had opened for a special occasion. "So," Linda said, crystal glass poised like a conductor's baton, "Bradley Prescott asked about you at the club yesterday, Emily. Remember him? His investment firm just acquired that adorable little building downtown." Jack's fingers tightened around his water glass as Emily's smile faltered for just a moment before reassembling itself. She reached for his hand under the table, but her fingers trembled slightly against his calloused palm. "Mom," Emily said quietly, "I'm sure Jack would rather hear about something else." Jack Miller wiped his hands on the shop rag, leaving new streaks of grease among the old. The Porsche engine in front of him had finally surrendered its secrets after 3 hours of methodical detective work. Not bad for a car, the dealer had declared unfixable. "Found it?" Mike called from across the garage, his voice echoing among the lifts. Jack nodded, holding up a small, twisted piece of metal. "Valve spring retainer. Somehow got bent without breaking. Makes a hell of a noise, but doesn't show up on diagnostics." He reached back into the engine bay, his calloused fingers working with surprising delicacy. This was the part of the job he loved most. The moment when broken things became whole again through nothing more complicated than understanding how they worked. "That's Emily's mom's friend, right?" Mike asked, gesturing at the car. "The one who insisted on speaking to the owner when you tried to help her?" Jack smiled tightly. "The very same. Mrs. Harrison wasn't thrilled when she realized the owner and the mechanic were one and the same person. Bet she'll be thrilled when you fix what the dealer couldn't." "Maybe." Jack tightened the last bolt with practiced precision. "Doesn't matter. Car doesn't care who fixes it, just that it's fixed right." He stepped back, surveying his work. Miller's Automotive wasn't the biggest shop in town, but in 5 years he'd built it from nothing into a respected business. It wouldn't impress Linda Prescott Wilson. Nothing about him did, but it was his, free and clear. Jack glanced at his watch. 6 months married to Emily, and he still rushed home every day like they were dating. The thought of her brought both warmth and a twinge of unease. Things had been different lately, subtle but there, like an engine running just a touch rough. "More roast, Jack?" Linda asked, the serving fork poised over the platter. The dining room in her colonial revival home made Jack feel like he was in a museum where everything was touchable, but nothing should be touched. "Thank you," Jack said, holding out his plate. In the 6 months since the wedding, these Sunday dinners had settled into a predictable routine of subtle class warfare. Linda laid a precise slice on his plate. "Emily tells me business is going well. It must be so satisfying doing such practical work." Jack felt Emily's foot gently touch his under the table, their code for let it go. "It is," he said simply. "I just finished rebuilding an engine the dealer said was beyond repair." "How resourceful," Linda replied, her smile tight. "Speaking of resources, Richard Bartlett's son, you remember the Bartletts, Emily, just made partner at his law firm. 32, and already making 7 figures. Emily cleared her throat. "Mom, we talked about this." "What?" "I'm just making conversation." Linda sipped her wine. "Oh, did I mention the charity gala for the Children's Hospital is next weekend? The Prescotts are chairing it this year. Bradley has done remarkable things with his father's investment firm." Jack felt his jaw tighten at the mention of Bradley Prescott. The man's name seemed to surface with suspicious frequency in Linda's conversations. "It sounds lovely," Emily said, "but Jack and I have plans next weekend." Linda's eyebrows arched slightly. "Do you? What a shame." Bradley specifically asked if you'd be there. Apparently, he still remembers your summer working together at the country club. Jack watched his wife's face carefully. A faint color touched her cheeks as she studied her plate. "That was years ago, Mom, before college." "Well," Linda continued, folding her napkin precisely, "it would be good for Jack to meet some of these people. Connections are everything after all." Jack met Emily's eyes across the table, seeing both apology and pleading in them. The unspoken request was clear. "Please, for my sake." "It's just one evening," Emily said later that night, her fingers nervously smoothing the embossed invitation. They stood in their kitchen, modest compared to Linda's showcase home, but theirs. The invitation to the charity gala looked out of place against their worn countertop like an orchid in a vegetable garden. Jack leaned against the refrigerator, arms crossed. "Your mother has been pushing Bradley Prescott on you since before we met. You really think this is just about charity?" "It's a public event for children's cancer research," Emily sighed. "It's not like she's setting us up on a blind date." "No, just trying to show you what you're missing by being with me." Jack couldn't keep the edge from his voice. "That's not fair." Emily set the invitation down. "My mother is difficult. But this matters to her, and honestly, it matters to me too. I used to volunteer at that hospital in college." Jack studied his wife's face. Emily had never been good at hiding her feelings. It was one of the things he loved about her. Now he saw genuine care about the charity, but something else too, a nervousness that seemed out of proportion. "There's more to this, isn't there?" he asked quietly. Emily hesitated. "My father will be there. He and Mom have barely spoken since the separation, but he's a major donor. It would mean a lot to have you with me, facing them both." Jack felt his resistance softening. Emily rarely asked him for anything, especially when it came to navigating her complicated family dynamics. "Fine," he relented, uncrossing his arms. "One night of uncomfortable small talk and overpriced rubber chicken, but I'm not renting a tux." Relief washed over Emily's face as she crossed to him. "Thank you. And don't worry about the tux. Dad left his behind when he moved out. Mom insisted I bring it home for you." Jack's half-smile didn't quite reach his eyes. The thought of wearing Emily's father's abandoned tuxedo to an event where Bradley Prescott would be waiting felt like a setup he couldn't quite articulate. But the gratitude in Emily's eyes as she kissed him pushed the concern to the back of his mind, for now. The ballroom of the Westbrook Hotel glittered like something from another world. Crystal chandeliers cast prismatic light over silk-draped tables, while a string quartet played Vivaldi in the corner. Jack tugged at his borrowed tuxedo, the sleeves just slightly too short at the wrists. The garment felt like a costume, which he supposed it was. "Stop fidgeting," Emily whispered, squeezing his arm. She looked stunning in a midnight blue gown that had appeared mysteriously from her mother's just-in-case collection. "You look handsome." "I look like the valet who forgot to give the car back," Jack muttered, but he smiled for her sake. Linda materialized beside them, champagne flute in hand. "Emily, darling, the hospital board members are just over there. You remember Dr. Winters from your volunteer days? He's been asking about you." Her eyes slid to Jack with practiced dismissal. "Jack, you don't mind if I borrow my daughter for introductions, do you? The bar is just there." Before Jack could respond, Linda had swept Emily away with a proprietary hand at her elbow. He watched them glide through the crowd, how seamlessly Emily transformed in this environment, back straightening, laugh becoming musical rather than genuine. People parted for them like water. Miller, right? A silver-haired man in an immaculate tuxedo appeared at his side. I'm Richard Harrison. You fixed my wife's Porsche. Jack nodded, grateful for the familiar territory. Yes, sir. How's it running? Like new. Better than new, actually. Harrison lowered his voice. Though Caroline would rather die than admit a local shop outperformed the dealer. For 15 minutes, Jack found himself in comfortable conversation about engines and maintenance schedules, until Harrison was pulled away by his wife, who managed to avoid looking directly at Jack despite standing 2 feet away. Jack drifted through clusters of people who seemed to know intrinsically that he didn't belong. Conversations paused momentarily as he approached, then resumed at a slightly higher pitch when he passed. Twice he caught sight of Emily across the room, now surrounded by a circle including Linda and a tall, sandy-haired man who stood too close to his wife. Bradley Prescott, he presumed. Each time Jack tried to make his way to them, the crowd mysteriously thickened, or a server appeared with a tray directly in his path. When he finally reached the spot where they'd been standing, they were gone. Jack searched the main ballroom methodically, glass of untouched scotch in hand. 20 minutes had passed since Emily had disappeared with her mother and Bradley. Couples swirled on the dance floor, while others clustered around high tables, but his wife was nowhere among them. Looking for someone? A young woman in catering black and white nodded sympathetically. My wife, Jack said. Blue dress, dark hair. Oh, Mrs. Miller, I think I saw her heading toward the East Wing. There's a private exhibit of hospital photography. They're showing donors. Jack followed her directions down a carpeted hallway that branched off from the main event. The corridor was quieter, the lighting dimmer. Framed black and white photographs of smiling children in hospital beds lined the walls. Patients helped by the charity, he assumed. He passed a series of smaller rooms where small groups discussed funding allocations over drinks. No sign of Emily. The corridor curved, leading to another wing that seemed even more private. The music from the ballroom faded entirely. At the far end of the hallway, Jack glimpsed movement. 2 figures slipped through a doorway, a flash of midnight blue and the sandy hair he'd noted earlier, Emily and Bradley. Linda stood watch nearby, glancing at her watch before turning away down another corridor. Jack froze, his mind racing to find innocent explanations, a private tour, a business discussion. But the furtiveness of their movements and Linda's watchful presence suggested something orchestrated. He started toward the door, then stopped. What would he say if he burst in? What would he see? The uncertainty held him in place long enough for doubt to creep in. Emily wouldn't, not with her mother's hand-picked suitor, not after 6 months of marriage, not deliberately, would she? By the time Jack reached the door, it was open and empty. Whatever had happened inside had concluded. He stood alone in the silent hallway, the distant music from the ballroom, a mocking reminder of the celebration, continuing without him. You disappeared for almost an hour, Jack said the next morning. He kept his voice neutral as he poured coffee in their kitchen. The gala program lay on the counter between them, its glossy cover showing smiling donors beneath the Children's Hospital logo. Emily looked up from her toast, dark circles beneath her eyes, suggesting she'd slept as poorly as he had. I told you, Mom dragged me to meet every board member and major donor. It was exhausting. Including Bradley Prescott? A flicker crossed her face, so brief he might have imagined it. Bradley was there, yes. He's on the investment committee for the hospital endowment. Jack set his mug down carefully. I saw you go into a room with him, in the East Wing. Emily's cheeks flushed slightly, but her voice remained steady. He wanted to show me the renovation plans for the children's oncology floor. He thought I might be interested since I used to volunteer there. Your mother was standing guard. My mother was networking, Jack. Emily reached across the counter for his hand. I know how it looked, but it was completely innocent. Bradley's engaged, for God's sake. Jack wanted to believe her. The alternatives were too painful to consider. I just hate how they treat you, Emily continued, her eyes softening. Mom was impossible last night. I should have stayed by your side. He squeezed her hand, noting how she'd skillfully shifted the focus from her disappearance to her mother's behavior. It's fine, he said, not because it was, but because he needed it to be. The next 3 weeks passed with a new tension beneath their routine. Emily seemed both more attentive and more distant, bringing home his favorite takeout, yet spending longer hours at her marketing job. She checked her phone more frequently, always angling the screen away. Twice, Jack woke to find her side of the bed empty, only to discover her sitting in the dark living room, claiming insomnia. Then came the morning. Jack found her in the bathroom, pale and shaking, a plastic test stick clutched in her hand. "Jack," she whispered, eyes wide with a mixture of fear and forced joy. "I'm pregnant." He stared at her, a cold realization spreading through his chest. Emily knew as well as he did that this was impossible. His vasectomy, a decision they'd made together before marriage, had been confirmed successful months ago. But there she stood, tears brimming, holding evidence of a betrayal she didn't yet know he understood. "Jack," Emily whispered again, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and forced excitement. "Did you hear me? I'm pregnant." The pregnancy test trembled in her hand, its pink lines glaring back at him like an accusation. Jack stared at it, unable to form words, as his mind raced through medical impossibilities. "But that's—" he finally managed, his voice barely audible. "That's not possible." Emily's smile faltered slightly before reassembling. "I know we thought with the vasectomy, but clearly something happened." She reached for his hand. "The doctor always said there was a tiny chance of failure, remember?" Jack did remember. A fraction of a percentage. Dr. Matthews had been clear. Practically impossible, but nothing in medicine is absolute. Yet 6 months ago, Jack's follow-up tests had confirmed 0 sperm count. Complete success. A fact Emily knew as well as he did. "We should see Dr. Matthews," he said carefully, watching her expression, "to confirm everything's okay." A flicker of something, panic, crossed Emily's face before she nodded too enthusiastically. "Of course, but isn't this amazing?" "A miracle, really." Jack forced himself to place his hand over hers, to smile as though his world wasn't imploding, as though he believed this could possibly be his child, as though he didn't understand exactly what this meant about the night she'd disappeared with Bradley at the gala. "Amazing," he echoed, the word hollow. Emily threw her arms around him, her body shaking with what might have been relief or fear or both. Over her shoulder, Jack stared at their reflection in the bathroom mirror, a perfect picture of expectant parents celebrating life-changing news. Only he could see the lie. Jack sat in his truck outside Dr. Matthews' office the following afternoon, staring at the building. He hadn't told Emily about this appointment. The receptionist had been surprised to hear from him rather than the supposedly expectant mother, but had squeezed him in. "Jack," Dr. Matthews greeted him warmly, gesturing to a chair in his office rather than an exam room. "What brings you in today? Everything all right with the vasectomy?" "My wife is pregnant," Jack said without preamble. The doctor's expression shifted from friendly to carefully neutral. "I see." and you're concerned about the vasectomy's effectiveness. I need to know if there's any possibility, any at all, that it's mine. Dr. Matthews opened Jack's file on his computer, studying it for a moment. Your 6-month follow-up showed 0 sperm count, 2 consecutive clear samples. He looked up. I don't like speaking in absolutes, but the chances would be extraordinarily remote. 1 in a million? More like winning the lottery twice while being struck by lightning. The doctor's eyes were compassionate but direct. I'm sorry, Jack. There are very few medical certainties, but this is about as close as we get. Jack nodded, his suspicions confirmed with clinical precision. Thank you for being straightforward. Outside in the parking lot, Jack sat motionless in his truck for 10 minutes. Then he drove to the pharmacy and purchased another pregnancy test, a different brand from the one Emily had used, just to be certain. That evening, he maintained a careful normalcy around Emily. He mentioned stopping by his accountant's office to discuss taxes, a plausible reason for his absence. She seemed relieved by his calm acceptance of the pregnancy, chatting about nursery colors while they prepared dinner. After Emily fell asleep, Jack slipped into the bathroom and retrieved the test she'd shown him from the wastebasket. He studied it carefully, noting the brand and serial number before wrapping it in tissue and placing it in a plastic bag. Then he checked the medicine cabinet, finding what he expected, an empty box containing 2 tests, not 1. In his home office, he placed the bag test in his desk drawer alongside Dr. Matthews' written statement about his vasectomy status. Then he opened his laptop and began methodically searching through their shared accounts, looking for unusual calls, unexplained expenses, anything that might reveal the extent of the deception. 2 hours into his search, a pattern emerged. Emily's phone calls to her mother had tripled in frequency since the charity gala. 3 days later, Jack was loading the dishwasher when Emily's phone chimed with an incoming call. She'd left it on the counter while taking a shower. Linda's name flashed on the screen. Jack hesitated only a moment before answering. Emily? Linda's voice carried the crisp authority he'd come to recognize. It's Jack, Linda. Emily's in the shower. Oh. A brief pause. I'll call back later. I'll tell her you called, Jack said, but Linda had already hung up. As he set the phone down, a notification appeared. Voicemail full. Emily was usually meticulous about deleting messages. Curious, Jack tapped the voicemail icon. No password required. They'd always had an open phone policy in their marriage. Until recently, the most recent saved message was from 3 weeks earlier, the day after the gala. Linda's voice. Emily, call me immediately. Bradley is concerned about complications from your discussion. We need to be strategic about next steps. Jack's hand tightened around the phone. He played the next saved message. Bradley's voice, tense and hushed. It's me. Your mother gave me your number. Look, I didn't expect things to go that far. Clarissa and I are still engaged. I can't. We need to talk about what happens if... The message cut off. Jack methodically played through each saved voicemail, his chest tightening with each revelation. The final message, from Emily to herself, a technique she used to record thoughts while driving, was the most devastating. Mom's right. This is the only way. Jack will never know the baby isn't his. The timing works. I just need to convince him the vasectomy failed. He loves me. He'll believe me because he needs to. Jack set the phone down precisely where he'd found it. His hands were steady, but something inside him had shattered beyond repair. He moved to his office and unlocked his computer, searching for their shared cloud storage. There, in Emily's folder, was a text message backup from her old phone. He found conversations with Linda spanning months, meticulously planning Emily's accidental meetings with Bradley. Linda's manipulations, Emily's initial resistance, then gradual compliance. The charity gala orchestrated specifically to bring Emily and Bradley together while Jack was kept occupied elsewhere. Jack closed the laptop and sat in perfect stillness, the weight of irrefutable evidence settling around him. Tomorrow night was Sunday, their regular dinner at Linda's house. The invitation had arrived yesterday, Emily mentioning casually that her mother wanted to discuss some exciting news. He knew now what that news was supposed to be, and he knew exactly how he would respond. After years of fixing broken machines, Jack understood that some things couldn't be repaired once fundamental trust was broken. But the truth, however painful, was always preferable to a life built on lies. He picked up his phone and texted Emily, who was visiting a friend. "Looking forward to dinner at your mother's tomorrow. I have some news to share as well." Jack stood in front of the bathroom mirror, his reflection solid and unsmiling. Sunday evening had arrived with the inevitability of gravity. In 2 hours, they would be seated at Linda's impeccable dining table, where Emily's pregnancy announcement would undoubtedly be met with perfectly orchestrated surprise and joy. He straightened his collar, a man preparing for war rather than dinner. In his pocket, a small USB drive contained copies of everything: the doctor's statement, Emily's voicemails, the text exchanges between mother and daughter. Physical evidence to counter inevitable denials. Yesterday, he had been tempted to confront Emily alone, to give her one chance to tell the truth before her mother could intervene. But something in her increasingly frantic attempts at normalcy, bringing home his favorite dessert, suggesting names for the non-existent baby, had hardened his resolve. This deception hadn't been Emily's alone. Linda had been the architect, Bradley the willing accomplice, Emily the executor. They deserved to face the truth together. Jack pocketed his phone and car keys, hearing Emily call from downstairs that they should leave soon. His hands were steady despite the thundering in his chest. For weeks, his world had been built on quicksand. Tonight, he would find solid ground again, not by saving his marriage, but by reclaiming his dignity. "Coming?" he called back, voice remarkably calm. The man in the mirror looked exactly like himself, yet fundamentally changed. There was clarity in his eyes that hadn't been there before, the hard-won certainty that truth, however painful, was preferable to comfortable lies. "Emily mentioned you have some news to share as well," Linda said, passing the serving dish of roasted potatoes. Her dining room gleamed with the careful polish of generational wealth. "Something about the business, perhaps?" Jack accepted the dish with a measured smile. "Let's save that for after dinner." Emily sat beside him, tense despite her attempts at casual conversation. She'd been watching him carefully all evening, clearly nervous about the pregnancy announcement she planned to make. Jack maintained a pleasant facade while mentally counting the evidence he carried. 3 voicemails, 16 text messages, 1 medical impossibility. "How's Bradley's engagement going?" Jack asked casually, serving himself potatoes. "Emily mentioned he's getting married soon." Linda's fork paused halfway to her mouth. "I believe it's scheduled for next spring. The Prescotts always do waterfront ceremonies at their lake house." "Interesting," Jack nodded. "And Clarissa, that's her name, right? She must be thrilled about the wedding plans." Emily coughed slightly, reaching for her water. "Jack, Mom was telling me about her garden club's fundraiser next month. Maybe we could—" "Actually," Linda interrupted, setting down her glass with a decisive clink, "I think it's time to discuss the exciting news Emily mentioned." She looked expectantly at her daughter. "Darling?" Emily's smile was brittle as she reached for Jack's hand under the table. "Mom, Dad." She glanced at her stepfather, who had remained characteristically silent throughout dinner. "Jack and we're going to have a baby." The choreographed reactions began. Linda's perfectly pitched gasp of delight, her husband's polite congratulations, Emily's rehearsed blend of shyness and excitement. Jack allowed it to unfold, watching the performance with detached interest. "How wonderful!" Linda exclaimed, eyes shining with triumph rather than tears. "I always knew you two would give me beautiful grandchildren." "There's just one problem," Jack said quietly, his voice cutting through the celebration like a blade. "It's not mine." The room froze. Emily's hand jerked away from his. "Jack, what are you talking about?" Emily's voice wavered between outrage and terror. "I had a vasectomy 6 months ago," he said, looking directly at Linda. "Emily knows this. My follow-up tests confirmed it was successful. 0 sperm count. It's medically impossible for me to father a child." Linda's face hardened. "Medical procedures fail all the time." "How dare you accuse my daughter?" "I have the doctor's written statement with me," Jack continued calmly, "along with some other interesting documents, like the voicemail Emily left herself, explaining how she planned to convince me the baby was mine when she knew it wasn't." Emily's face drained of color. "You went through my phone?" "After you went through my life? Yes." Jack removed the USB drive from his pocket, placing it on the immaculate tablecloth. "Everything's here. The messages between you and your mother planning accidental meetings with Bradley, the voicemails after the gala, the timing of the pregnancy test purchase." He turned to Emily, whose eyes had filled with tears. "I gave you every chance to tell me the truth. Every chance to be honest about what happened with Bradley. Instead, you tried to pass off his child as mine." Linda slammed her hand on the table. "This is preposterous, Emily. Don't listen to this." "He's clearly unstable. Play her the voicemail, Emily," Jack suggested softly. "The one where you recorded yourself saying, and I quote, 'Mom's right. This is the only way. Jack will never know the baby isn't his.'" Emily covered her face with her hands, her shoulders beginning to shake. The careful facade of family harmony collapsed completely, leaving only the wreckage of exposed truths. "Emily mentioned you have some news to share as well," Linda said, passing the serving dish of roasted potatoes. Her dining room gleamed with the careful polish of generational wealth. "Something about the business, perhaps?" Jack accepted the dish with a measured smile. "Let's save that for after dinner." Emily sat beside him, tense despite her attempts at casual conversation. She'd been watching him carefully all evening, clearly nervous about the pregnancy announcement she planned to make. Jack maintained a pleasant facade while mentally counting the evidence he carried. 3 voicemails, 16 text messages, 1 medical impossibility. "How's Bradley's engagement going?" Jack asked casually, serving himself potatoes. "Emily mentioned he's getting married soon." Linda's fork paused halfway to her mouth. "I believe it's scheduled for next spring. The Prescotts always do waterfront ceremonies at their lake house." "Interesting," Jack nodded. "And Clarissa, that's her name, right? She must be thrilled about the wedding plans." Emily coughed slightly, reaching for her water. "Jack, Mom was telling me about her garden club's fundraiser next month. Maybe we could—" "Actually," Linda interrupted, setting down her glass with a decisive clink, "I think it's time to discuss the exciting news Emily mentioned." She looked expectantly at her daughter. "Darling?" Emily's smile was brittle as she reached for Jack's hand under the table. "Mom, Dad?" She glanced at her stepfather, who had remained characteristically silent throughout dinner. Jack and we're going to have a baby." The choreographed reactions began. Linda's perfectly pitched gasp of delight, her husband's polite congratulations, Emily's rehearsed blend of shyness and excitement. Jack allowed it to unfold, watching the performance with detached interest. "How wonderful!" Linda exclaimed, eyes shining with triumph rather than tears. "I always knew you two would give me beautiful grandchildren." "There's just one problem," Jack said quietly, his voice cutting through the celebration like a blade. "It's not mine." The room froze. Emily's hand jerked away from his. "Jack, what are you talking about?" Emily's voice wavered between outrage and terror. "I had a vasectomy 6 months ago," he said, looking directly at Linda. "Emily knows this. My follow-up tests confirmed it was successful. 0 sperm count. It's medically impossible for me to father a child." Linda's face hardened. "Medical procedures fail all the time. How dare you accuse my daughter?" "I have the doctor's written statement with me," Jack continued calmly, "along with some other interesting documents, like the voicemail Emily left herself, explaining how she planned to convince me the baby was mine when she knew it wasn't." Emily's face drained of color. "You went through my phone?" "After you went through my life, yes." Jack removed the USB drive from his pocket, placing it on the immaculate tablecloth. "Everything's here. The messages between you and your mother planning accidental meetings with Bradley. The voicemails after the gala. The timing of the pregnancy test purchase." He turned to Emily, whose eyes had filled with tears. "I gave you every chance to tell me the truth. Every chance to be honest about what happened with Bradley. Instead, you tried to pass off his child as mine." Linda slammed her hand on the table. "This is preposterous. Emily, don't listen to this. He's clearly unstable." "Play her the voicemail, Emily," Jack suggested softly. "The one where you recorded yourself saying, and I quote, 'Mom's right, this is the only way. Jack will never know the baby isn't his.'" Emily covered her face with her hands, her shoulders beginning to shake. The careful facade of family harmony collapsed completely, leaving only the wreckage of exposed truths. 3 days after the confrontation at Linda's, Jack returned to the house. He'd agreed to Emily's request to come while she was at work, to gather more of his things without the pain of facing each other. Mike's couch had been a welcome refuge, but he needed his tools and work clothes. The house was unnervingly silent as he entered. Their home, formerly their sanctuary, felt like a museum of a life that no longer existed. In the kitchen, Emily had left his favorite coffee mug on the counter, washed and ready, a small gesture that twisted in his chest. Jack moved through the rooms methodically, packing essentials in a duffel bag. In the bedroom, he paused before opening drawers that contained his life, socks arranged by color, T-shirts neatly folded, the ordinary objects of shared existence. When had the everyday become so weighted with meaning? On Emily's nightstand, the framed photo of their wedding day had been turned face down, a small mercy or a gesture of shame. He couldn't decide which. He sat heavily on the edge of the bed, suddenly overwhelmed by the sheer physicality of separation. For 6 months, he'd built his life around a foundation that had been structurally unsound from the beginning. The betrayal wasn't just Emily's actions with Bradley. It was the realization that what he'd believed was real had been partially illusory. "What now?" he whispered to the empty room. No answer came, just the relentless ticking of the bedside clock he'd repaired last year. Jack ran his hand over the quilt Emily's grandmother had made for them as a wedding gift. It occurred to him that the parts of their marriage that had been real, his love, his commitment, his daily choices, still belonged to him. Her betrayal couldn't erase the person he had been, even if it had shattered the person they were together. He zipped the duffel bag closed with a sound of finality. The silence no longer seemed accusing, merely expectant, waiting to see what he would build from these ruins. "I almost didn't call you," Jack admitted, wrapping his hands around the steaming mug. The coffee shop was quiet at mid-morning, most tables empty except for a few remote workers tapping at laptops. Across from him, Frank Davidson nodded, his weathered face creasing with understanding. At 62, Frank had been Jack's first employer, mentor, and eventually friend. "But you did. Didn't know who else might understand." Jack stared into his coffee. "You went through something similar." 12 years ago, Frank confirmed. "Caroline and her tennis instructor. Classic, right? Found out when she got pregnant." He took a measured sip. "Difference was, we'd been married 20 years, not 6 months, 2 teenage kids." Jack looked up. "How did you... what did you do?" "Exactly what you did. Confronted the truth. Then spent 2 months sleeping in my garage and drinking too much." Frank's directness was part of what had always drawn Jack to him, not recommending that last part. "I'm staying at Mike's, sleeping on his couch." "Good. You need people around you right now." Frank leaned forward. "Look, I'm going to say something that might sound strange. This betrayal, it's painful as hell, but it's also a gift." Jack's jaw tightened. "Some gift. Bear with me. What happened with Emily and her mother. It showed you the truth while you're still young. Before kids, before decades invested. I spent 20 years with someone who saw me as a provider, not a partner." Frank's eyes held Jack steadily. "You have something now that most people never get. A clean break and a second chance to build a life based on truth." "I loved her," Jack said quietly. "I still don't understand how she could do this." "That's because you're thinking about it from your perspective. Someone who values honesty. Emily was raised by Linda, who values appearance and status above all else." Frank shrugged. "People reveal who they really are through their choices, Jack. Emily revealed herself. So did you. By walking away. By refusing to live a lie. By having enough self-respect to demand truth." Frank's voice softened. "The question now is, what will you build with that self-respect?" Jack was silent for a long moment. "I don't know yet." "You don't need to." Frank stood, clapping a hand on Jack's shoulder. "Just promise me you won't let this turn you bitter. The greatest revenge against people who try to diminish you is to live well without them." As Frank left for an appointment, Jack remained, nursing his cooling coffee. The bitterness on his tongue was strangely clarifying, much like the conversation had been. For the first time since the confrontation, he felt something like possibility stirring beneath the grief. That evening, Jack stood in the living room of what would now be just his house. After their conversation, Frank had called his realtor daughter, who confirmed Emily had signed papers to relinquish her claim on the property. Likely Linda's influence, preferring a clean financial break to a protracted legal battle that would air family laundry. Jack surveyed the space with new eyes. Emily had taken surprisingly little. Some clothes, personal items, a few wedding gifts from her side. The furniture remained, the art on the walls, the dishes in the cabinets, as if she'd tried to erase herself while leaving the container of their life intact. He began methodically, removing her photographs from the mantel, collecting stray items that were distinctly hers into a box. Not angrily, not vindictively, just creating clarity about what remained and what was gone. His phone buzzed with a text. "Emily. Can we talk? Please." I'm not asking for reconciliation. I just need to explain. Jack stared at the message for a long moment before responding. There's nothing to explain that would change anything. I wish you well, but we need a clean break. He set the phone down and continued his task. In the spare room they'd used as shared office space, he cleared Emily's desk, boxing her papers and books. The emptied space seemed to breathe more freely. Tomorrow he would bring in his drafting table from the garage, perhaps set up a proper workspace for the custom design projects he'd always wanted to pursue. As he worked, a curious lightness began to replace the heaviness in his chest. Each emptied drawer and cleared surface represented not just loss, but possibility. The house was smaller without Emily in it, but somehow more authentic. By midnight, he had reorganized the entire main floor. Sitting on the couch with a glass of water, Jack realized what Frank had meant about betrayal being a painful gift. In losing the relationship he'd thought he wanted, he had gained something he hadn't known he needed: the freedom to build a life founded on truth rather than illusion. Tomorrow, he would return to the garage, to the work that had always grounded him. He would repair what others considered broken beyond hope, and in doing so, perhaps he would repair himself as well. Jack's hands moved with practiced precision over the disassembled engine parts spread across his workbench. 2 months after the confrontation at Linda's, he had established a new rhythm to his days. The garage provided both sanctuary and purpose, a place where problems had clear solutions, where broken things could be methodically restored. "That's the third classic carburetor rebuild this month," Mike observed, wiping his hands on a shop rag as he approached. "Word's getting around about your specialty work." Jack nodded, carefully cleaning the venturi with a small brush. "Frank sent over another client yesterday, 1967 Mustang with the original 289. Nice." Mike leaned against the workbench. "How's the house coming along?" "Finished the kitchen remodel last weekend." Jack adjusted his work light. "Turns out countertops are easier to install than I thought." What Jack didn't say was how therapeutic the physical labor had been, tearing out the old countertops Emily had always complained about, replacing them with something he'd chosen himself. Each renovation project had become a tangible marker of his rebuilding process. "You know," Mike said after a comfortable silence, "Thompson called again about buying you out, offered another 10% over his last offer." Jack looked up from his work. "Still not interested?" "Figured as much. Just thought you should know." Mike grinned. Told him Miller's Automotive wasn't going anywhere. There was understanding in Mike's casual conversation, a recognition that Jack's healing came through work and creation rather than words. In the weeks following the divorce filing, Mike had provided space without pressure, allowing Jack to process at his own pace. As Jack reassembled the carburetor, he felt a quiet satisfaction that extended beyond the mechanical. 6 months ago, his world had shattered. Now, piece by piece, he was building something new, not to replace what was lost, but to create something authentic that had never existed before. "Test run tomorrow?" Mike asked, nodding at the nearly completed rebuild. "First thing," Jack confirmed. "Should purr like it did in '65. Some things, he had discovered, could be fixed after all. Jack was selecting produce at the farmer's market when he heard her voice. "Jack." He turned to find Emily standing behind him, looking both nervous and determined. Her hair was different, shorter, lighter, and she wore an outfit he'd never seen before. 3 months since their last communication, when divorce papers were finalized. "Emily," he acknowledged, his voice neutral. "Didn't expect to see you here." "I know." She fidgeted with her purse strap. "I've been trying to work up the courage to call you. Then I saw you here and I need to talk to you." Jack placed a tomato in his basket, buying time as shoppers moved around them. "I'm not sure there's anything left to say." "Please," she said, stepping closer. "Just coffee. 10 minutes. I need to explain some things." Her eyes held the familiar appeal that once would have instantly softened his resolve. But 3 months of reflection had clarified what Frank had tried to tell him. Emily had been raised to see manipulation as communication. "Emily," he said quietly, "explaining won't change what happened." "I know that." Her voice trembled slightly. "But I've been in therapy. I've been working through things with my mom, understanding why I made those choices. I'm different now." Jack studied her, seeing both the woman he had loved and the stranger who had betrayed him. "How's the baby?" he asked evenly. Emily flinched. "I miscarried." "At 10 weeks?" "I'm sorry to hear that," he said, and meant it. "Mom thinks it was the stress," she continued quickly. "After everything fell apart, Bradley wanted nothing to do with me. His engagement ended too." She touched his arm. "I know we can't go back, but I miss you, Jack. I miss us. Maybe we could try again, slowly. Just friendship at first." The request hung between them, freighted with everything unsaid. For a brief moment Jack felt the pull of familiarity. The path of least resistance would be to offer comfort, to step back into the role he'd played before. Instead, he gently removed her hand from his arm. "I wish you healing, Emily, I really do. But we can't rebuild on a foundation that was never solid to begin with." "Jack, I need to go," he said, gesturing toward the checkout. "Take care of yourself." As he walked away, Jack felt neither triumph nor anger, just the quiet certainty that boundaries weren't walls to keep others out, but foundations to build himself upon. Jack sat on a bench outside the market, setting down his grocery bags to check a text from Mike about a parts delivery. The spring afternoon was perfect. Warm sun, cool breeze, trees in full bloom along the park across the street. "Excuse me," a woman's voice interrupted. "Is this yours?" "It was under your bench." He looked up to see a woman in her early 30s holding his receipt. She had curly dark hair pulled back in a casual ponytail and warm brown eyes that crinkled slightly at the corners. "Thanks," he said, taking the paper. "Would have been annoying to need that for a return." "No problem. I'm a receipt keeper, too." She smiled, nodding at the empty space on the bench. "Mind if I sit for a minute? I've been walking around the market for an hour." "Sure." Jack moved his bags to make room. She sat with a relieved sigh, setting down her own canvas shopping bag. "I always overdo it at farmers' markets. Something about all the fresh produce makes me think I'm suddenly going to cook elaborate meals every night." Jack found himself smiling. "Let me guess. You've got at least 3 vegetables you've never successfully cooked before?" "4," she admitted with a laugh, "including something called kohlrabi that I bought entirely because the name sounded interesting." "Peel it, slice it thin, little olive oil and salt. Roast at 425, Jack offered. She looked at him with surprise. "You cook?" "I'm learning. It's a recent project." "I'm Sarah, by the way," she said, extending her hand. "Jack." Her handshake was firm and direct, no hesitation, no hidden agenda. They fell into easy conversation about cooking disasters, the best stands at the market, the merits of homemade versus store-bought pasta. There was something refreshing about her straightforwardness. She laughed openly, asked direct questions, shared small stories about herself without calculation. After 15 minutes, she glanced at her watch. "I should get going. Need to get this stuff in the fridge." "Of course." She stood, then hesitated. "This might be forward, but would you like to get coffee sometime? There's a great place just down the block from here. Saturday morning, maybe. Jack felt a momentary tightening in his chest, caution born from recent experience. But there was nothing in Sarah's expression that reminded him of Emily or Linda, just open interest without manipulation. "I'd like that," he found himself saying. "Saturday works." As she walked away after exchanging numbers, Jack remained on the bench, processing the unexpected encounter. The ease of their conversation had caught him off guard. How long had it been since he'd experienced interaction without underlying tension? The possibility of connection without agenda felt both terrifying and hopeful. He wasn't ready to trust completely, not yet, but perhaps he was ready to take a small step forward. 3 weeks of coffee dates with Sarah had led to this moment. Jack had invited her to dinner at his home, a step that felt significant for reasons beyond the meal itself. As they finished the pasta he'd made, Jack found himself at a crossroads he'd been approaching all evening. "Something on your mind?" Sarah asked, setting down her wine glass. "You keep starting sentences and then changing course." Jack smiled faintly. She'd noticed, of course she had. In their brief time together, he'd discovered Sarah's remarkable ability to read people without judging them. "There's something I need to tell you," he said finally, "about my past. Before this goes any further." Sarah nodded, her expression open. "I figured there was a story there." Jack took a deep breath. "I was married. It ended 6 months ago." The words came easier than he expected. "My wife had an affair with someone her mother had been pushing her toward since before our wedding. Then she got pregnant and tried to pass it off as mine, knowing I'd had a vasectomy." He watched Sarah's face carefully, searching for shock or pity. Instead, she listened with steady attention as he continued. "Her mother orchestrated most of it, the affair, the cover-up. When I confronted them with evidence, everything fell apart." Jack's voice remained even, the pain now a dull ache rather than the sharp agony it once had been. "I couldn't stay with someone capable of that level of deception." "That's—" Sarah began, then paused, considering her words. "I'm telling you this because I believe in starting with the truth," Jack said. "And because it's changed how I approach relationships. I value honesty above almost everything else now." He didn't mention his fear that Sarah might see him differently now, as damaged goods or someone with too much baggage, or worse, that she might question whether his experience had made him incapable of trust. "Thank you for telling me," Sarah said quietly. Jack nodded, his vulnerability hanging in the air between them. He had opened the door to his past. Now he could only wait to see if she would walk through it or away from it. "My husband died 4 years ago," Sarah said after a moment of silence. Jack looked up, surprised by the revelation. "Cancer," she continued. "But before he died, I discovered he'd been living a double life for most of our marriage. He had another family, a woman and 2 children, in Cincinnati." She took a sip of wine, her hand steady. "I found out when the hospital called his wife about his condition." "Sarah, I'm so sorry," Jack said softly. "And it was—" She paused, searching for words. "Devastating doesn't quite cover it. Not just the betrayal, but realizing that the person I thought I knew best in the world was essentially a stranger." Jack nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. "The thing is," Sarah continued, "after I got past the initial shock and grief, I had to decide who I wanted to be in response to it. I could become bitter, distrustful, closed off, and believe me, I was tempted." Her eyes met his. "Or I could choose to learn from it without letting it define me." "How did you do that?" Jack asked. "Painfully," she admitted with a small laugh. Therapy helped. So did time. Eventually, I realized that Mark's choices were about him, not me. His deception didn't mean I was foolish for having trusted him. It meant he wasn't worthy of that trust. Jack felt something shift in his chest, a recognition of a shared journey. "I've been hesitant about dating again," Sarah said. "Not just because of Mark, but because I've become protective of the life I've rebuilt. I need someone who understands the value of truth, even difficult truth." "That's exactly it," Jack said, leaning forward. "After everything happened with Emily, people kept telling me I'd find someone else, move on. But it wasn't about finding a replacement. It was about figuring out what kind of relationship I actually wanted." Sarah smiled. "One built on honesty from the beginning. Even when it's uncomfortable," Jack added. "Especially then." She reached across the table, her hand finding his. "Thank you for telling me about Emily. I know that couldn't have been easy." The tension in Jack's shoulders released. In Sarah's understanding, he found not just acceptance of his past, but recognition of the strength it had taken to move through it. A month later, Jack and Sarah sat at a corner table in Frank's favorite diner, waiting for him to arrive. Sunday brunch had become their ritual, often with Frank joining them. "Sorry I'm late," Frank announced, sliding into the booth across from them. "Got caught up talking to Richard Harrison at the parts store." "The Porsche owner?" Jack asked, passing him a menu. "The very same. Speaking of which—" Frank paused as the waitress delivered coffee. "Did you hear about Linda Prescott Wilson?" Jack tensed slightly. "No. What about her?" "Harrison's wife is on some charity board with her. Apparently, the whole social circle knows about the pregnancy scheme now." Frank stirred sugar into his coffee. "After your confrontation, Linda's husband finally had enough. Filed for divorce, then told everyone who would listen what she'd tried to do." Jack felt Sarah's hand cover his under the table. "And Emily?" he asked, surprising himself with how detached he felt asking. "Working at some marketing firm in Columbus. Harrison says she's cut ties with her mother." Frank shrugged. "Seems they both got exactly what they deserved. Natural consequences, no revenge required." Jack nodded, processing the information without the emotional charge it once would have carried. "I hope she finds her way," he said simply. The conversation shifted to Frank's new restoration project. But later, as they walked through the park after brunch, Sarah brought it up again. "How do you feel about the news?" she asked, her arm linked through his. Jack considered the question. "Relieved, I think. Not because they're suffering, but because I don't have to be the one to deliver consequences. The truth did that on its own." Sarah nodded. "That's how I felt when I heard Mark's other family had sued his estate. I didn't need to pursue justice. It found its own way." They stopped by the lake, watching ducks glide across the water. "I used to think relationships were like engines," Jack said reflectively. "You follow the manual, do the maintenance, and everything works as designed." "But they're not machines at all." "What are they then?" Sarah asked, her head tilting slightly against his shoulder. "More like gardens. They need the right foundation, consistent care, and a lot of patience." He turned to face her. "And complete honesty about what you're planting." Sarah smiled, understanding the metaphor. "I like that," she said. "Honest foundations." 1 year after the confrontation at Linda's dining table, Jack stood in his workshop, applying the final coat of varnish to the rocking chair he'd built from cherry wood. Afternoon sunlight streamed through the windows he'd installed himself, casting warm patterns across the polished concrete floor. The garage had gradually transformed into a proper woodworking studio, a space where broken things weren't just fixed, but where new things could be created entirely. "It's beautiful," Sarah said, leaning against the doorframe. She'd learned to navigate his creative space without interrupting his focus, understanding that his hands needed to work while his mind processed life. Jack ran his palm over the smooth arm of the chair. "Frank's granddaughter will be here tomorrow to pick it up for her baby's nursery." Sarah crossed the room, her fingers tracing the subtle curve of the backrest. "You know what strikes me about your work? Everything you build has such solid foundations." He smiled at the observation. There had been a time when that word, foundations, had represented everything he'd lost. Now it symbolized everything he'd found. "I've been thinking lately about what I've learned," Jack said, setting his brush aside. "When Emily's deception came to light, I thought I was just losing a marriage. I didn't realize I was actually finding myself." "How so?" Sarah asked, perching on his workbench. "The hardest truth wasn't that she betrayed me. It was recognizing that I'd been willing to compromise my own dignity to maintain peace." He gestured to the chair. "Like using cheap fasteners on fine wood. It might look good initially, but it won't stand the test of time." Sarah nodded thoughtfully. "Truth isn't just about honesty with others. It's honesty with yourself about what you need and deserve." "Exactly. And boundaries aren't walls, they're foundations." Jack moved beside her, their shoulders touching comfortably. "They don't keep people out. They establish what kind of relationship can be built." Outside, spring had fully arrived, new growth visible through the workshop windows, just as Jack's life had cycled from winter to rebirth, from devastation to reconstruction. "The greatest gift of that painful time," he said quietly, "was learning that when truth collapses something false, it creates space for something genuine to grow." Sarah's hand found his, fingers intertwining naturally. In that simple touch lay everything he'd once thought impossible: trust rebuilt, not despite past wounds, but because of the wisdom those wounds had taught them both. The rocking chair stood ready for its new home, a tangible symbol of what careful hands could create when building on honest foundations.